NABJ family, thank you guys so much for joining us from near and far. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the moderator of this amazing, incredible, necessary, and timely panel. My name is Naima Abdullahi, an Atlanta-based journalist currently working for the NBC affiliate in Atlanta and also doing work with Vibe magazine and other culture platforms. It is an honor to help facilitate this incredible conversation. We hope you learned something new today. And we have three incredible guests. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna allow them to introduce themselves, not in any specific order. First, we're going to start off with Maxwell Pierce.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maxwell Pierce. I am a player for the Harlem Globetrotters. I am an influencer. I am an activist, and I'm really just standing for what is right.
And Dr. David Ponton III, let me say that last part right, the third. If you could introduce yourself. You could turn on your mic, a little technical difficulty. Sorry.
Hi, my name is David Ponton. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. My research is on residential segregation and its consequences on Black American lives.
And our third guest, Glenn Berkins, a veteran journalist in the Charlotte market. If you could introduce yourself for our audience today.
Absolutely. I think that word veteran just kind of means old. I've been around for a while. I've been a reporter and editor at a number of newspapers, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Wall Street Journal, LA Times. I was an editor for a number of years at the Charlotte Observer. I currently publish an online news site here in Charlotte, qcitymetro.com, which serves the African American community.
And each of you were selected strategically to have a wholesome conversation about the topic of this panel, dealing with microaggressions. Before we go into the historic, social, society context of what that means and how to identify it, we want to start off with Maxwell. Maxwell, you decided to share your story a little after it happened, but something inspired you to share something that happened to you recently. If you can give us a timeline, just so people are clear, and were you prepared for it to go viral and that it could be a learning lesson for society as a whole?
So yes, I was certainly prepared for this story to circulate. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to make it known, is because I knew that it would be relatable for a lot of people. My experience is not unique, and it is extremely common, and it's something that has the potential to start a national conversation.
No, absolutely. Tell us about that encounter from your recollection. What happened that day? And at that very moment, were you able to identify what was happening, or did it take time to really process the magnitude and urgency of bringing attention to that incident?
Yes, so I was in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was on Good Day, Alabama, which is a morning show for Fox 6 News, and I was giving an interview for an upcoming game when I was showing off a few basketball tricks, and one of the reporters pulled out a tangerine from his pocket, threw it at me. I gave it back to him. He then threw it to someone else off camera who threw it at me for a second time, and then maybe 20 seconds after that, a banana was thrown from a white woman behind the camera, all on a live television segment. So when I caught the banana, I was extremely shocked. I didn't know how to even begin to react. So as soon as the segment ended, I took off my microphone, I left the studio immediately and got a copy of the video, because I knew that it would be really important for me to have this if I ever decided to share my story. So from the month of January up until about June, I was trying my best to suppress the incident, the experience, because I knew that I still had a job to do, and I didn't want it to get in the way of my job. And then the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd happened, and this experience that was sitting right below the surface for me couldn't be suppressed anymore. And I knew from that point on that it was time for me to speak up about my experience and use it as a teachable moment for people that look like me and people that don't.
And I know NABJ got involved from the start as far as, advocating for the community, for African Americans, for people of color. Did you receive any mixed criticism? Those who saw what you saw and what you felt, and those who say, what's the big deal?
Absolutely. This story, this experience was met with a lot of support, but also a ton of negativity and criticism and almost refusal to understand or acknowledge what is apparent. This situation is representative of the daily microaggressions that we as Black people have to experience. And I have tried to use this incident as a way to teach people about the dark history of this country as it pertains to relating Black people to monkeys.
You know, we're seeing an intersection of sports and
Mhm.
culture and politics. That intersection is very timely right now, even from a historic standpoint of Tommy Smith and what he did, what Colin Kaepernick has been going through the last 3 or 4 years, and what you're experiencing of saying, you know what, I'm going to share my experience, but I'm also going to go into the humanitarian lane as well. Is that something that always piqued your interest, or was this a moment that you realized there's something more I could be doing with my platform?
So it's a combination of I would say yes to both. I have always been interested. I've always been a very reserved person, but there comes a point in time where you become fed up with what is happening. And I think that a lot of people in this country, especially athletes, are reaching that peak and surpassing that threshold. And so they've had enough, and they're using their labor power and the true reach of their platforms to send a message, whether it's by not playing a game or just by speaking out when they know that millions of people are watching.
If you can also let the audience who's watching this know, what was the aftermath? After you had that uncomfortable conversation with the TV station and the company, and you brought it to their attention, this is how I processed it, this is not right. What was the aftermath? How was the conversations afterwards?
So I spent the months of June and July going back and forth with Fox 6 News, trying to get a public apology and acknowledgement from the anchors who threw the fruit. And the time that it took from then until we were able to get closer to a resolve has taught me a lot, and hopefully it has taught them a lot. I had an opportunity to do an interview with the news director from Fox 6 News about this incident in particular, and how conversations that are uncomfortable can enhance our cultural awareness. Unfortunately, when that interview was aired, they omitted all of the information that I had presented as to why throwing a banana at a Black man is so offensive. So, you know, that was extremely disheartening, but it also wasn't new. We all have been seeing that since we were little with our education, the way that our history has been carefully omitted or presented in a way to save face of the oppressor and really lighten the treatment of Black people throughout our history.
And timing is so important, you know, from when the incident happened to when you shared your story in light of the Breonna Taylor case, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks. You were inspired to share your own story because it's about time corporations finally saw what we experience as being Black in America. If those incidents, those tragic incidents never happened, is this a story you would have ever shared?
I do think I would have. I'm not sure how long it would have taken me. I'm not sure what would have exactly prompted me to wake up one morning and say, today's the day, but I know eventually I would have gotten there. So I'm happy that I could have done it sooner than later. And again, one of the lessons that I've learned that I want to share with everyone is that when anything like this happens, check it at the door and don't wait. I know sometimes it takes a while to truly process what's happening and appropriately respond, but never stay silent about this or anything that really violates you as a Black person.
And we're very fortunate that you were able to share your story. You've been on many platforms, dozens of platforms, using it as an educational moment. What is next for you as you start to see that intersection we just talked about? What is next for you and how you envision your future?
So for me, one of my goals is to continue to educate myself, because I know the more that I can attain information-wise, the more I can spread, and hopefully it'll inspire and empower others to do the same. Right now, we're seeing an extreme movement from athletes using their platforms to be activists and fight for what's right. And it's being met with a lot of ignorance and refusal to even listen before understanding. So one of my goals is to try and figure out a way where athletes can become more respected, because at the end of the day, we are humans first. And no matter how successful we may become, we still have to deal with the traumas and the difficulties of being Black in America.
Another question I want to ask you is, how immediately did it go viral? From the moment you pressed publish, you publish it, you walk away, you're like, all right, cool. How long until you saw the numbers really start to come in? Was it instantaneous? Did it take a few days?
I would say it took a few days. For some people, for one, the video that I put out, it was about 5 minutes long, and it's very detailed. It explains what happened, it explains why I waited, and it explains why this act is so egregious and offensive, and really how we can learn from it. So it wasn't really a shock to me that it took a few days for it to really pick up and circulate. But I'm happy that it did, because it made a tremendous impact on everyone who came across it.
And one last question I want to ask you is, and then we'll start one-on-one conversations and then a group conversation. What advice do you have for a high school athlete, a middle school athlete, a young person who has always been a little bit hesitant of sharing their voice with the world? They may share their athletic abilities and how skilled they are in those avenues, but what advice do you have for someone who may not find comfort yet in speaking up?
I would tell them that you are not going to be the first one to speak out on your own, and understanding that, you know, when you look at people like Colin Kaepernick and even Tommy Smith and John Carlos, they spoke out individually, but now we're starting to see the magnitude of their actions and how they have almost risen to another level as in terms of being an athlete who's an activist. So there may be a delayed gratification there, but you speaking out will pay off. And, you know, there's strength in numbers. So the more that you speak out, the more it empowers other people. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And next we want to go to Dr. David Ponton. If you can break down, so you are a historian, also a professor at University of South Florida. Explain to us microaggression. Let's really go into it, and any information you may have to paint a more national image of what millions of people deal with every day.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. And Naima, if this doesn't work correctly, just, you know, signal to me, and I'll see if I can get that to work right. So I'm just gonna do a very quick overview of what microaggressions are and their consequences on people. So microaggressions are indignities toward a person based on racial group, skin color, hair texture, gender expression, sexual identity, and so on. In this particular case, we're talking about a racial microaggression, but it is also probably gendered because of the ways that Black men are associated with sports, and also the ways that Black men are associated with apes. Microaggressions can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental. So walking into a newsroom that's all white, that's an environmental microaggression. But then you also have the behavioral microaggression of having fruit thrown in this case. Microaggressions are always hostile, derogatory, or negative, even if the offender doesn't recognize that they are. And they can be intentional or unintentional. Oftentimes the biases that people have are implicit and they're not even aware that they exist, but the consequences are still the same regardless. They can be interpersonal or institutional, and they're often unrecognized by the persons who are not targeted by them. So having this conversation and the kind of backlash that people like Maxwell face is kind of expected, because people tend not to recognize the oppression that other people face, especially when it is implicit and subtle in this way. And as Maxwell already said, microaggressions, they're experienced on a daily basis. They're chronic, and that is particularly harmful for people who have to deal with them. Microaggressions and the Black Ape Mental Association is a historical problem. European scientists developed this idea of the great chain of being when they were trying to figure out, where do we put people on a hierarchy of humans? And how do we justify slavery in the face of the fact that these are people that we're putting into slavery? So the idea that they created was that there's a great chain, an evolutionary chain, and white people were at the top and African people were at the bottom of that chain. It got to the extreme point where they even debated whether there was a distinction between African people and apes. Most often, this belief about Black people being ape-like now is implicit, but it is strong among Americans. Empirical studies have found that Americans hold this view even when they're not explicitly taught that this is an association. Even if they never hear someone say Black people and apes are alike, that association is so embedded in our culture and in our media that everyone imbibes it and picks up on it. It's detectable as an implicit association because of that fact. So we know that when this happens, when these associations are present, we find these kinds of empirical evidence that it is there. It leads to greater endorsement of police violence against Black people. So when people think Black people are apes, they're more likely to condone police violence. It influences criminal sentencing. From judges to juries, they're more likely to execute or convict Black people who they associate with apes, and also Black people who are of darker skin tones and who have facial features that are deemed more Afrocentric. We know that officers who score high on implicit associations of Black people as apes are more likely to use force on Black children. And we know that this also happens in the realm of journalism. So when Black people are convicted of crimes, what we see in journalism and newspaper reports and articles is more ape-relevant language about the person. Racial microaggressions matter because they have long-term consequences, not just on the professional work experience of Black people, although it does create a hostile work environment. It also creates chronic stress, physiological evidence of the fact that we are dealing with this racism on a daily basis. That results in increased hypertension, so high blood pressure, and all of its comorbidities like diabetes. You see increased use of drugs and alcohol, and depressive symptoms in people who deal with microaggressions. So here are the quick takeaways. They're subtle, they're implicit, and the target group recognizes them, whereas the people who are doing the offending might not. Microaggressions are only micro in the sense that they are subtle and implicit and unrecognized. We've also known from studies that the effects of microaggressions are just as bad and possibly worse than actual explicit forms of racism, because they are dealt with on a daily basis, and because people, in this case, we see Maxwell sort of suppressed it, and we all suppress microaggressions all the time, but that creates that stress that results in these long-term health outcomes. And then finally, microaggressions reinforce institutionalized biases, and together these limit critical mass representation. So if you walk into a newsroom that's all white and you experience microaggressions, you're more likely to leave. And so the next person of color who comes in is not going to see another person of color there because you were compelled to leave before they got there. And so the cycle then continues itself.
One question I want to ask is, in light of all this research, first of all, you know, we throw around the word being woke all the time, but that wow, like you do this, you're about this. With all that research in-depth as it can get, how can someone utilize that information to affect change for someone who may think it was unintentional or may not realize that that's what they're doing to some of their employees?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of avenues to take. One avenue is to recognize first that it's an institutional problem. So oftentimes people think this is a conversation about whether or not that person who threw a banana was a good person. And that's not really the question. We don't know her intention. We don't know what kinds of views she may or may not hold. In fact, research shows that people who score low on prejudice still have the same levels of negative implicit associations about Black people. And those negative implicit associations affect how they behave. So even good people do things like this in part because it's so embedded in our culture that Black people are associated with animals, that Black people are associated with aggression or hostility or violence or crime. So the first thing is to not treat it as an individual problem, but to treat it as an institutional one. And for people who have power, or people who are in positions of power and who care, what you can do is diversify your workspace. Make sure there's a critical mass of representation of people who have different points of view, particularly people who have anti-racist points of view. And make sure that their voices are heard and that they're not punished when they bring these things up. And the second thing people can do is maybe they'll feel guilty. There is such a thing as white guilt. And that may be a process that some people have to go to. But get beyond the guilt and get into a mode of thinking about what is possible for you to do as a person who has privilege and who has power and who recognizes that there's something you can.
Dr. Ponton, thank you so much for bringing light into your research, because that really helps on a contextual level and research level. Look at it from a bigger perspective. Now we go to Glenn Berkins. Glenn, if you can tell us, with your experience as a newsroom manager, even as a media entrepreneur as well, what have you realized about the industry over your years of experience? And are some of what Dr. Ponton said things that you've experienced that resonate with you on a personal level? If you can turn on your mic, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. At the risk of just kind of repeating, what microaggressions really do is objectify us. They take us out of the realm of being human and make us somehow an object. I've seen it in a number of ways in newsrooms. I've experienced it myself. I've seen others do it. It ranges from the very subtle to the more overt. It's not always someone throwing a fruit or a banana. Sometimes it is if there's a Black person in the newsroom or a gay person or a woman, then you become that official person, so that whenever a topic comes up that involves African Americans, then Glenn is that person we have to go to. Now that's a very tricky thing, because in our newsrooms, I would like to think that we are there for a reason, but no journalist should be made to feel that he or she is the resident Black person who knows everything and can speak on every issue concerning race, or a woman should be made to feel that she's the resident woman or the resident gay person, what have you. Other microaggressions that I've seen in newsrooms are subtle ways in which sometimes our white colleagues attempt to minimize our accomplishments by little things that allude to affirmative action, if you will. Though that word may not ever come up. Oh, I'm sure you'll get that job. They need a Black person in that position, or something like that, that looks beyond your qualifications and simply reduces you to a Black person who will be selected for that reason only. Other things are more...
I want to interrupt you for a second. With those kind of microaggressions in newsrooms of affirmative action, oftentimes have you seen that devalue someone's value where they may not see their own worth because, society wants them to think of themselves in a certain way?
Microaggressions are funny because as Maxwell pointed out, to a degree, you have to really process it. One of the things about them is that you sometimes ask yourself, am I being overly sensitive? But we know when this does not feel right. And it's not necessarily that the other person meant it as a slight or whatever. But over time, absolutely, it plays on your psyche, and as I said, it makes you feel that you're being objectified, that you're not being judged based on who you are, your unique talents, your unique ability. So absolutely. One of the things that I tried to do when I was an editor, I tried to ban the phrase "because of the color of his skin." How many times you read an article and it says that someone was denied entrance because of the color of their skin, Well, nothing has ever happened to me because of the color of my skin. The color of my skin does not trigger anything. Racism, things have happened to me because of bigotry. Things have happened to me because of racism. Things have happened to me because of discrimination. But when we say, and when we write the phrase, because of the color of their skin, it takes the spotlight off of the thing that we should be talking about, racism, discrimination, whatever, and it puts it on my skin color, and it becomes my burden because I have Black skin. So there are different types of microaggressions that are real. That last one, sometimes we buy into that. I've heard Black people say, well, this happened to me because of the color of my skin, as if that person's skin color was to blame.
If we really look at TV markets and DMAs, sometimes Black journalists may be in a market where they are the only person of color in that newsroom. They're the only Black person. You know, identifying it is one thing, but how can someone gain the confidence to speak up, especially in an industry where they may not have the support system in that market, or the confidence to bring attention to how it made them feel?
That's a very difficult question because we're all different. Some people are very quick to speak up. Other people are more reluctant to speak up in a situation like that. I guess the only thing that I would say is that when we feel this way, we should not suffer in silence. We should go to that person. We should go to management. We should go to HR and explain what happened. As has been pointed out, part of the problem is that sometimes the person who is leveling the microaggression is totally unaware. So there's a very interesting dynamic there. I think what really needs to be done is that companies, newsrooms in particular, since we're journalists and we're talking about that, this needs to be part of an ongoing conversation. It needs to, and it cries out for newsrooms that are more diverse, not just racially diverse, but culturally diverse in terms of sexual identity, what have you.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to let the participants, our viewers who are watching this webinar, if you have a question, there is a section of this conversation where our guests are going to answer your question. So in the Q&A section, please feel free to write your question, not necessarily in the chat, but in the Q&A section, write your question, and we're going to be able to get that to you as soon as possible. So I want to open up a bigger discussion. We've heard, you know, the personal account of Maxwell. We've also heard the academic research behind it and how you can identify it, and also from a newsroom leader, newsroom manager. And I kind of want all of us to have a discussion. You know, now that we're showing every aspect of this, how can we move our people forward in having that support system to believe in their own confidence and to believe in their own experience, that what they experienced was real and that it wasn't in their head?
So I think it starts with conversations like this. I think that the more we speak to one another and get a firm grasp on how common it really is and how common the set of emotions and the thought process that follows a microaggression is, I think we'll become more confident in what we're feeling and it'll feel more validated.
And what about you, Dr. Ponton?
I'm processing this question, and as Glenn pointed out, you have some very difficult questions for us to answer. One of the things we can do, so one of the things that the research shows is that when people suppress what they're going through, it creates that chronic stress. But it also shows when they try to address these kinds of behaviors in a professional workspace immediately, then they have to face all sorts of other psychological terrors, like the threat of losing a job, the threat of being demoted, and also the constant threat of being gaslit, being told that the thing that you experience and the things that you feel are invalid. So one of the things that, that we can do on a personal level is just to recognize that the things that you feel don't have to be valid to some objective liberal notion of what it means to feel racism. At the end of the day, the people who experience it understand it the best. And so it is important to, as Maxwell said, not be reluctant to speak up, to process as you will process, but also to recognize that when people tell you your experiences aren't valid, that's the time to double down. Because if you don't, then you can internalize all of the negative things that they're saying about you. And on top of that, add to the stress that has been imposed on you.
And to young journalists, I would also recommend having mentors in the industry. That is so important. As it's been pointed out, it's not always prudent, or it can have repercussions if you are constantly pointing out microaggressions, because that's what they are. They are microaggressions. It's not like someone did something blatant or called you the N-word. So there's plausible deniability. And even if you aren't fired or whatever, maybe you're simply kind of shunned, pushed away, left out of meetings, left out of conversations, because people feel that you're being overly sensitive. So one of the things that, going back to what I said, is that it's important, especially for young journalists, to have mentors, to have people who have been in newsrooms, who have navigated these tricky situations, people they can go to and say, look, this is what happened to me today. How do you think I should handle this? Has anything like this ever happened to you? So yes, I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. And I want to, we've taken that topic nationally, now let's take it globally, right? I was born in Africa from Somalia. My family lived in Ethiopia, Kenya. We moved to the States in '96. When the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, some of my relatives asked me a lot of questions. You know, the African-American experience and the African experience sometimes are two different experiences, even though there are a lot of similarities. But the Black experience can be found anywhere. There are Black people in Europe. There are Black people in Australia. There are Black people everywhere. Black is what connects all of us, even though the African-American experience is exclusive to America. How do we view this? I know, Glenn, you've worked overseas as well. How can we view this topic from an international standpoint? Because racism can be found anywhere in the world. It's not something, systemic racism could be found in Europe, in China, wherever. So how do we take this conversation further on a global scale?
In the 1990s, I was stationed in South Africa. This was toward the very end of apartheid. I was there as well for the transition when Nelson Mandela was elected. And one of the microaggressions that I encountered most often in South Africa, for example, was having white South Africans tell me, "Well, you're not like our Blacks. You're different," as a way of saying, well, they deserve one thing, but you're not like that. You're educated, you're articulate, whatever. They didn't use those words, but they would always say, "You're not like our Blacks." I experienced microaggressions in other parts of the world where I've traveled with my family, for example. I've had Asian people come up and want to touch my daughter's braids when she was a little girl without asking, wanting to take pictures of us as if we were some tourist attraction. Once again, they probably did not realize what they were doing or the ramifications that it had on us. I remember one day in Switzerland, we decided that we would just stay and eat in our hotel room because every time we hit the street, people would come up to us and start taking pictures. So you're absolutely right. It's not just an American phenomenon. It's all over. And oftentimes the perpetrators don't really realize what they're doing. But as a Black person, you feel it, and you feel it very deeply and innately.
One question I want to open up to everyone as we have time for a group Q&A is, there's so much love for Black culture, whether it's hip hop, Hollywood, Tyler Perry's success. You look at Black culture, everyone loves it. Black culture is pop culture. It's the #1 generator of culture in America, but the Black experience doesn't always get the same type of love? How do we bridge those two things so that from an academic and personal experience standpoint, when we do look at microaggressions, you know, that's a form of wanting to bridge that gap between Black culture and Black experience? I'm just going to open it up to, you know, as you guys feel the need to respond.
I'm going to let the doctor handle that one.
So I think we're seeing a lot of it happening. We're seeing that bridging happening right now. We're seeing it in music, we're seeing it in television, we're seeing it in sports. We're seeing people who have platforms, people who are the major producers of culture, are using their platforms to talk about these kinds of issues. And they're doing it from multiple vectors. So we have conversations about microaggressions and also explicit racism that results in higher mortality rates for Black people. But we also talk about it now because we have so many people who are interested, so many celebrities who are using their voices, who are interested in specific, very specific intersections. So what happens to a Black woman who is giving birth in a hospital? She might be facing explicit racism, but oftentimes she's facing microaggressions. Microaggressions, people's beliefs, implicit beliefs that Black people experience less pain than other people, people's notions that Black women are abusers of the healthcare system and of prescription drugs, so they don't want to treat them with care. And then we see these higher mortality rates, but you have people like Serena Williams speaking out. And I think that's helping us to create that bridge. There are people who won't listen, people who don't care to listen. But I do think that it's happening and that we can appreciate, I think Saidiya Hartman said it this way, that emancipation is not a destination, it is a process. And the work that people are doing with these platforms right now is the emancipatory process. And I think we can appreciate that.
And what about you, Maxwell? How do you also look at that? I mean, you know, when you think about your fan base and the amount of support you've had over the years, if the same group of people ain't supporting you in this lane, is that the support you needed all along?
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit of a complex question. I think just like David said, it truly is a process. People are not going to learn overnight, especially the way our society is conditioning us and has conditioned us. I'm 24 years old, and I may be one of the youngest in this panel, but I know in order for me to unlearn a lot of the social habits that I've developed through growing in this society, it would take people even longer. So I definitely understand that, you know, this is going to be a process for the people who don't support me to eventually understand and respect my opinion on issues that relate to me and our people. And I'm willing to have the patience because I understand that it's going to take some time for people to truly wake up and understand.
Absolutely.
One other thing I might add, and I won't make this a political conversation, but we're at a very unique place in our nation's history right now. There was a time when at least we felt that we were making progress, that overt racism, and I know we're talking about microaggressions, but that overt racism was something that people were fairly ashamed of. That's not the case anymore. So if license is being given for overt racism, then imagine how difficult it is to have these discussions about these microaggressions, things that are, as I said, that can be plausibly denied, or for that matter, people may not even realize that they're engaging in. So it's very hard to have these kinds of conversations in this current political environment.
Absolutely. And now we're going to start off the Q&A section. We have 6 questions that have been put in the section. I'm going to go with the first question. And Glenn, this is actually to you. What is an example of a replacement of because of the color of my skin?
I think I gave a couple. Because of discrimination, because of gender bias, because of whatever. I think we need to name that thing. It is not because of the color of my skin. The color of my skin has never caused anything. people's reactions to the color of my skin may have. But when we say that, and I repeat, it puts the onus, it puts the burden on our skin. And there's nothing wrong with our skin. There's nothing inherent about being Black that causes anything. It is so so there are any number of ways we can rephrase that. And if I could do one thing to minimize microaggressions, that would be one phrase I would take out of the English language because of the color of their skin. It's because of discrimination, because of racial bias, because of bigotry, because of sexual discrimination against LGBTQ people, whatever, what have you. We need to call it what it is.
The next question, I think, Maxwell, you could answer this. How can allies help in the workplace? What are some, tips and advice you have for allies who may not personally identify with the experience, but can still lend their voice to help others?
I think to be a true ally, you have to dedicate yourself to self-education on the kinds of injustices and experiences that people who belong to marginalized groups in our society have to experience. And I think you have to commit to the idea that it's going to be a lifelong learning process in order to change the way that you behave and how others behave.
And if I can add on to that, I also think an important thing to do, and this applies to everyone, right, is to recognize that you have to be an ally for other people. So as a Black man in spaces that are predominantly male, I have a responsibility to make sure that women in that space are treated appropriately, but also respected for all of the talents and expertise that they bring. And I have the same responsibility as Glenn is pointing out in terms of people with disabilities, in terms of sexual orientation. Like, we all have the capacity to build these larger, what Martin Luther King would have called rainbow coalitions, and to make sure that, so if I'm defending you, if I'm recognizing that microaggressions are happening to you on the basis of gender, it might be a little easier for you to recognize that they're happening to me on the basis of race. But making sure that we're all taking part, as Max said, in educating ourselves, not just on the issue of race, but on all of these intersections, is important. And once we have coalitions of people within these spaces, I think it might be a little easier for people to recognize. I don't experience that thing, but I do know what it feels like. And I'm going to be on their side.
Thank you so much for that input. And Glenn, I think this is a great question for you. Sometimes the offender is a gatekeeper. How do I strike a balance between speaking up for myself and also not burning bridges and preventing opportunities in my career? I'm sure as a newsroom leader and as a innovator too, as a media entrepreneur, you have a lot of mentees. And I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but how do you strike the right kind of conversation with a gatekeeper?
Boy, that is a really difficult question. It's a really difficult question.
And I didn't ask, they typed
yeah,
out.
I know. If we were talking about things that are blatant, this would be a much easier conversation. In my opinion, what happened to Maxwell was blatant, and he should have gotten an apology, and he should have gotten an apology quickly. But when you're talking about some of these microaggressions, as has been stated, often the offender did not intend to offend and doesn't even understand why or how what he or she said was offensive. So that makes those conversations very, very difficult. When that person is a gatekeeper, I don't think you should ever, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think one should ever back away from having those discussions. I think they have to be done in a way where you don't burn bridges, especially if you believe that it was not done with malice. I guess to some degree, we all have to educate each other. As David said, microaggressions go all ways. Sometimes it may be a Black person who is exhibiting a microaggression towards some other group. We're not just recipients of microaggressions. So when that person is a gatekeeper, I think it does make having that conversation more difficult. But if it's something that a person feels strongly about, I would advise a mentee to find a way to have that conversation. Say, you know, you probably never even realized how this made me feel. Or you may not have even realized that what you said might be offensive. Don't necessarily go in with guns blazing. You know, offer that unless you think, of course, you need to go in with guns blazing. But when we're talking about things that people may not realize they've done, it can be a tricky situation. And so you have to validate that person and give them the benefit of the doubt that perhaps you didn't mean it this way. Perhaps you didn't even realize that it could be understood this way, but here's how it made me feel. Talk about how it made you feel and not necessarily impugning the other person's motives or intentions.
Absolutely. And the next question is open up to all of you. If you are guilty of microaggression and someone points it out to you, what is the best way to respond? Is it an apology? Can you ask for, you know, tools and things you may need to spark up the conversation? So if someone identifies that they're guilty of it, like, wow, I didn't even realize it, what do they do afterwards?
So personally, I think an apology is required within that process. I think that should be first and foremost, but also to ensure the person that you have disrespected or offended, that you will do your due diligence in trying to learn why that was offensive and correct that behavior for the future. I think it's also important that internally you try and remember that the impact of your intentions is not necessarily representative of your moral character, because sometimes with microaggressions, they can offend and disrespect us. And as a result, the person who felt violated, whenever they decide to react however they react, we naturally feel like it's an assault on our moral character. So I would try to be open-minded about that and understand that the two don't necessarily always have to be hand in hand.
I would just reiterate what he just said. An apology goes a long way, even if it was unintentional, even if you don't understand it. If you've said or done something that made another person feel less than, then just apologize, especially if you didn't intend it. That's what an apology is. I mean, that's what saying I'm sorry. I am sorry that I made you feel that way. I didn't intend to make you feel that way. But it goes more than simply giving lip service. It's also trying to understand, truly understand, and not just dismiss it. Okay, all right, you got your apology, now let's move on. It's about truly trying to understand and put yourself in another person's place and understand why what you said or what you did made that person feel less than.
Mm-hmm. And the next question, let me make sure I read it right. How can you put microaggression concept in a social context? I mean, in social segregation where there is no color racism. For example, I'm from Haiti. You may have prejudice between people from countryside and people living in the city. I have read that in America, there is social tensions between hillbillies and people in the big city. So outside of color lines, you know, how can it play in socioeconomics, what type of region you live in, socioeconomically as well?
Yeah, I think the person who asked the question kind of answered it, which is that microaggressions do happen across social contexts. They happen within cultures that see themselves as monoracial. So a place like Haiti, where most people identify as being Afro-descendant, if not everybody, but microaggressions might exist based on skin color. In fact, we know that is a fact of lived experience, oftentimes in the Caribbean and Latin America, but also here in the United States. Colorism has a major outsized impact, and it happens even within families. So I think the question has been answered by the person who posed it. That's how you put it into broader context. You think about the various ways that we place groups of people into hierarchies, and we determine who is worth more value and who is not.
And one final question I want to ask, because I'd love to debrief with you guys. What's the proper procedure for an HR person? Let's say someone files a report or has a private conversation with HR and takes it to that next level. How should that conversation be facilitated? Should there be a meeting between both parties that should be facilitated? What are the different methods that could happen to move the conversation forward in a newsroom or in any workplace environment?
Boy, that's kind of out of my lane, not being an HR person. I definitely think that when it is taken to HR, it should not be dismissed. Whether a conversation is had between the two people, the person who was offended and the person who offended, I don't know. I don't know what best HR practices are. One thing that I would say, however, is that if an HR person is constantly being confronted with these types of problems, or especially if it relates to one person or one department or whatever, then that's indicative of a larger problem. And it's indicative that, that perhaps there needs to be some type of training, some type of broader discussions in that particular newsroom or that particular business.
And there's a question I think that all of you could possibly chime in on. If these microaggressions are based on implicit bias, meaning people aren't even aware of what's influencing them, why is the response so often outrage and confrontation rather than communication and education? Because we do live in a cancel culture where social media will cancel you, or, this or that may happen. But, why is the response oftentimes that and not this?
I think, again, the reaction from the perpetrator is to feel like it's an assault on your moral character when you commit a microaggression and it gets called out. So I think when a microaggression happens to you, you don't know how to process it, you don't know how to unpack it. And sometimes we do react strongly or impulsively rather than impactfully. And so that causes the perpetrator to get defensive and block out anything that the person who was disrespected is saying.
Absolutely. And I think you did it in a very educational way, where you were able to recall what happened and use it as a very educational way of communicating it effectively. How, in ways of where the message of how you experienced it may not be communicated effectively, what tips could we provide them?
That's tough. I don't know, maybe one of you guys want to take that?
Maybe, but I do want to jump in on the question itself, because there was an assumption embedded in the question. And so it was one that sort of led to an answer, which is, why is the outcome often outrage and confrontation? Well, the fact of the matter is that is not often the outcome of when people experience microaggressions. Outrage happens when people reach a boiling point where they've experienced microaggressions day after day after day after day, and they haven't said anything, or they've been saying something and they haven't been listened to, and they haven't been heard. It should not be it should not be something that surprises the people in that newsroom who have learned that throwing a banana at a Black person might be offensive. But for some reason, they were surprised that Max had something to say. And that's not outrage. It's confrontational, but confrontation is what it means to have a conversation. I think what people want, oftentimes when they ask questions like this, not to impugn the person who asked the question, but oftentimes what people want is for Black people to deal with hostility, and for that hostility to always be dealt with by us. Mm-hmm. And if it's ever turned around, if a question is ever asked in the other direction, the hostility that they feel and they experience, it wrangles them. If this is a minor inconvenience for you that someone brought up the fact that you did a microaggression, imagine what it's like to have experienced those microaggressions your entire life.
That is an important takeaway. And this is our 5-minute warning that it is about to wrap up. I want to make sure the people who are watching this webinar are able to communicate with you guys. Glenn, let people know how they can stay in touch with you. If all of you can share how people can stay in touch with you so that you're helping the community continue to engage in this kind of discussion.
Absolutely. Once again, my website is qcitymetro.com. That's QCITYMETRO.com. So to reach me, it's gburkins@qcitymetro.com. GBURKINS @qcitymetro.com. I would welcome a chance to talk with anyone, or if there is a young reporter out there, especially in print, who's looking for a mentor, I would be happy to serve that role as best I can.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, I am equally as approachable on my social media platforms, and their handles are all the same. It's Maxwell Pierce, PEARCE, and that's on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. So yeah.
And you can reach me through USF, University of South Florida. So my email is dponton@usf.edu. And I'll be back on social media one day.
One day. You're taking a break. Well, this is a complete honor. You guys can reach me on social media on all platforms @NemerDreamer. That's a 8th grade nickname that stuck around, and somehow it's still my professional handle. This has been a tremendous honor as a journalist, as a Black journalist, as a proud member of NABJ. When Ken Lemon calls and says, I have an idea, you know it's to better our community, to engage in the kind of discussions that fuels us, because we're all separated now, where we can't have the right kind of fellowship the way we like to fellowship.
Right.
So it's good to come together on this webinar to engage in important discussions. So I'm grateful for all of your time, for being vulnerable, for being honest, for engaging in a conversation that we oftentimes don't have access to. So thank you for providing that access. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you for having us.
Absolutely. And thank you guys so much for joining this discussion. We will be wrapping up, but continue, go on all their social media handles or emails and communicate with them. But we really appreciate your time. And